With the Austrian Grand Prix just around the corner, I wanted to go back in time and take a look at one of the craziest, most dramatic MotoGP races I have ever watched. A race that will go down in history due to the absolute absurd nature of it. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the story of the 2021 MotoGP Austrian Grand Prix. But before we go into what happened in the actual race, I want to give you the context of what happened before this race. Of course, 2021 was a year that was heavily affected by the pandemic still, and as a result we had a lot of races this year where we had 2 races at one track, and Austria was one of them. The Austrian Grand Prix was the second of 2 races, a week after the Styrian Grand Prix, in which Jorge Martin scored his first ever win in MotoGP. Joining him on the podium were Joan Mir and Fabio Quartararo, meaning Fabio Quartararo was leading the championship on 172 points, 40 points ahead of Johann Zarco. He was closely followed by Joan Mir and then Pecco Bagnaia. Bagnaia, by the way, was still waiting for his first win in MotoGP. The championship was also seeing the return of Marc Marquez, who had recently returned after his horror injury in 2020. And he even won a fairly recent race in Sachsenring. However, he was still reporting massive amounts of pain in his right shoulder, and Austria was a track which extremely aggravated that in the last weekend. So Marc was not at his best and he was constantly struggling late on in races. And the paddock was also still processing the news of Valentino Rossi announcing his retirement at the end of the year. He had announced it just before the Styrian Grand Prix, and there was sort of a certain vibe about trying to appreciate the last we had of Valentino Rossi now that we knew he was going to end his career at the end of the season. However, one big story going into this weekend was Maverick Vinales. At the Styrian Grand Prix in the previous weekend, Vinales sort of had a self-implosion. He spent the entirety of the race at the bottom 3. And at the end of the race, he seemingly tried to blow up the engine or something. I don't really know what he was doing, but if you look at the video on YouTube, the engine was revving like crazy. He was understandably fired for this by Yamaha because, well, he tried to blow up the engine, meaning that there was only one Yamaha on the grid for this weekend. This combined with Lorenzo Savadori having an injury meant that there was only 20 of the usual 22 riders lining up on the grid. The weekend in general had quite a lot of mixed weather in practice, but come Sunday we had the grid as follows. On pole we had Jorge Martin with Quartararo and Bagnaia on the front row with him. Then from there we had Zarco, Marc Marquez, Jack Miller, Joan Mir, Aleix Espargaro, Miguel Oliveira and Brad Binder. And you can see the rest. Austria had always been a track that suited Ducati very well. They'd won 6 of the last 7 races there. And that was very evident here, with all 4 factory Ducatis being on the front 2 rows. So the bikes lined up on the grid preparing for what seemed like a normal race. However, just above them, dark, ominous rain clouds were forming in the mountains and they were fast approaching the track. And as the bikes set off for the formation laps, the first spots of rains were appearing on the camera lens. And we were starting to get the sense that this was no ordinary race. Just a quick heads up lads, unfortunately I will not be able to show any race footage from this race because apparently Dorna are really strict in terms of copyrighting people who use their footage, and I'm not willing to risk having my video smited down by the copyright gods. So we're just going to have to make do with some low quality screenshots. I'm sorry, but it is what it is. Alright, let's get into the race. And with that, the 5 red lights go out for 28 laps of the Austrian Grand Prix. And Jorge Martin gets an absolutely insane launch from pole position and leads into turn 1. Quartararo made a good start, but he had a bit of a moment going into turn 1, which forced him and Johann Zarco wide. This compromised both their exits and Bagnaia was able to overtake them both going into turn 3, and he claimed 2nd place. Then going into turn 4, Jorge Martin runs wide and then surrenders the lead to Pecco Bagnaia. Then going to turn 6, Quartararo goes for a move on Martin, but completely fucks it and hits Martin, sending them both wide. Martin recovers back to 2nd while Quartararo drops down to 5th by the end of a lap, behind both Zarco and Marc Marquez. And during all this, the white flag was being waved, meaning the race was officially declared as wet and all riders could come into the pits at any time to change onto a bike with wet tyres. Remember, this was all on lap 1 and all the riders were going around quite tentatively because they were unsure what the conditions were like across the track. And the rain clouds were only getting closer. On to lap 2, Quartararo drops another place, this time behind Jack Miller, he's now in 6th place, and Johann Zarco takes 2nd place from Jorge Martin. Then Jorge Martin then loses another spot, this time to Marc Marquez. Meanwhile, during all this in the opening 2 laps, Iker Lecuona on the Tech 3 KTM gained 8 positions, going from 16th to 8th in the opening 2 laps. A quite remarkable first couple of laps. Lap 3, Marc Marquez goes into 2nd, taking it from Johann Zarco, and then Fabio Quartararo starts his comeback, taking 5th back from Jack Miller. Lap 4, going to turn 1, Jorge Martin overtakes Zarco for 3rd, and then he takes Marc Marquez on the straight. While Fabio Quartararo sets the fastest lap on the race and quickly begins to close in on the front 4. However, his fastest lap is still a second slower than the expected pace of the race, showing that the conditions around the racetrack were affecting the pace. Lap 5, Quartararo moves into 4th, surpassing Johann Zarco, and we also saw Enea Bastianini retire on this lap, for a very unusual reason. The cover on the side of his bike flew off, which gave everybody the unique opportunity to see what the inside of a 2019 Ducati looked like. Lap 6, the top guys are still going at each other. Jorge Martin runs wide into turn 1, giving 2nd place to Marc Marquez, but then Martin gets back at him at turn 4, and then Martin decides to go for a move on Bagnaia for the lead. And we usually know how outbreaking Bagnaia ends. He runs wide and drops to 4th, and after a very frantic opening 6 laps, we had a relatively good idea of who the main contenders of the race were. We had Pecco Bagnaia, Marc Marquez, Quartararo, Martin and Johann Zarco in a group of the front 5, and then a half a second gap to Jack Miller, Brad Binder and Joan Mir, with Oliveira and Aleix Espargaro rounding out the top 10. Lap 7, Marc Marquez has a moment going out of turn 1 and then he gets overtaken by both Quartararo and Jorge Martin. And Quartararo showed some extreme bravery going around the outside of Jorge Martin going to turn 3. This was peak Quartararo. He was right at the peak of his powers at this point and he was full of confidence, and this overtake proved that. Then into turn 6 of that lap, Jorge Martin has another moment and then he gives 3rd place back to Marc Marquez. And then once again we start to see spots of rain on the camera lens. And it was at this point that the commentator started to report some thunder in the background, which usually means it's about to shit tip it down with rain. Lap 8, this was when we first saw the white flag with a red cross, which means it is raining in that area. We saw this at turn 2 and 3, but not really anywhere else in the track. But this meant it was beginning to slightly rain. It wasn't raining much, but it was still enough to slightly affect the pace. The lap times did drop on that lap. It was also on this lap where Fabio Quartararo took the lead from Pecco Bagnaia at turn 6. However, this was the era where Yamaha had absolutely no straight line speed whatsoever, so on the home straight Bagnaia was able to breeze past and regain the lead. The order then remained the same for a few laps until lap 12 when Joan Mir passed Jack Miller into turn 6. Quartararo then set the fastest lap of the race, which was showing that the rain was holding off for a bit. It clearly stopped raining at turn 3, and the riders were pushing as hard as they could. And by lap 14, Bagnaia, Quartararo and Marc Marquez started to pull away from Martin and Zarco, and Joan Mir was quickly catching those two. And all while this was happening, the track was getting noticeably darker. Like, if you looked at the images from the start of the race till now, it's much darker. The rain was clearly on its way. But it still refused to rain. The track was still dry. It was also around this point where we started seeing the first track limits warnings of the race, for Brad Binder and for Jorge Martin. Lap 17, more thunder is being reported by the commentators, but still the rain holds off. And then on lap 18, Johann Zarco crashes out of 5th place at turn 9. This was a big moment for the championship, because remember, Zarco was 2nd in the championship going into this race, but now he is out, he will be scoring 0 points. Lap 20, we're getting closer to the end of the race now, and Fabio Quartararo completely outbrakes himself going into turn 3, and gives 2nd place to Marc Marquez. It was also this lap where Jack Miller started his usual, he has no tyres left, and drops down the order. He lost 6th place to Brad Binder and then dropped down to 8th behind Aleix Espargaro. Lap 22 now, Marc Marquez had a go at Bagnaia for the lead of the race, trying a classic switchback move, but the Ducati had the superior straight line speed and Bagnaia was able to maintain the lead. And as the leaders applied the brakes going into turn 4, we saw more rain. More rain on the camera lens, but this time it seemed heavier. The white flag with the red cross was back out and it was across a lot more of the circuit this time. And in the distance we could see that in the mountains the rain was absolutely bucketing it down. The question was, would it reach the circuit in the remaining 6 laps? Lap times dropped significantly on this lap by 1.5 seconds, showing that the rain was now definitely affecting the lap times and the pace of the race. Lap 23, Miguel Oliveira crashes out of 8th place at turn 1, and with the rain potentially coming, he's usually a master in the rain. To this day I still wonder what he could have done in this race, because he's great in the rain. And at this point the rain flags were being waved across pretty much half the track at this point. They were all throughout sectors 2 and 3. And at the end of lap 23, both Jack Miller and Alex Rins made the early call to go into the pits and put on a wet bike. They were running in 8th and 11th respectively, and they both thought it was time to move on to wet tyres. Jack Miller was ahead of Alex Rins going into the pit, but then he completely shat the bike swap, and then Rins ended up coming out ahead of Jack Miller going into the pits. Lap 24, the rain was clearly affecting the pace now, as within the space of 2 laps, the gap between the top 6 had come from 5 seconds to 1.1 seconds now. We now had a top 6 of Bagnaia, Marquez, Quartararo, Martin, Joan Mir and Brad Binder all bunched up in a group now, when just a few laps ago they were all spread out. And behind them there was a big gap back to Aleix Espargaro in 7th. The riders were clearly going a lot slower than the previous laps, and they were clearly a lot more tentative going around the track. The rain was getting heavier. Lap 25 going into turn 1, Bagnaia goes a bit wide and surrenders the lead to Marc Marquez, while Martin passes Quartararo for 3rd place. And then going into turn 3, Quartararo comes from absolutely miles back and overtakes both Martin and Bagnaia to get into 2nd. Like, just look at how far behind he is. How the hell did he manage to make that corner? This was peak Quartararo. He pulled off some insane overtakes in this race. Martin then takes 3rd from Bagnaia going into turn 4, but then into turn 6 Quartararo is for some reason slow on exit. I guess the rain was affecting him. Then he drops to 4th while Bagnaia managed to go back up to 2nd. So much position swapping in these laps, it was absolutely mental. Meanwhile, Brad Binder and Joan Mir were both also trying to get involved, but they ended up just funneling in at the back. It was absolute chaos at this point, and during all this, Marc Marquez was trying to build a gap at the front. By the end of the lap, he had a half a second gap. Some of the riders put their hands up going around the final few corners, which indicated they wanted the race to get stopped because of the rain, but that wasn't an option. So at the end of lap 25, all the top 6 riders came into the pits to change to wet tyres. Well, apart from one man, Brad Binder, commonly known as the bravest and the most mental of the MotoGP riders, he stayed out on dry tyres, on a track which was getting wetter and wetter by a second. So the top 5 of Marquez, Bagnaia, Martin, Quartararo and Joan Mir all pitted for wet tyres. Everyone else stayed out. They were willing to take the gamble of staying on a potentially wet track on dry tyres. Because remember, there were only 3 laps left at this point, and for a lot of riders this was a situation of high risk, high reward. A lot of these riders could be getting a potential career best result by staying out, so all the back markers, they all stayed out. They thought it was worth taking the risk. So now we were in a position where the top 5 riders, who were among the best on the grid at the time, they all pitted and they were on wet tyres on a track that was not entirely wet yet, but there was a big risk of it completely tipping it down. They were all on wet tyres and they would in theory have a pace advantage, but they were 33 seconds behind Brad Binder with only 3 laps left. And all the usual back markers and people in the midfield, the likes of Aleix Espargaro, Nakagami, they all stayed out. And they were all now in contention for the podium. And with 3 laps left, the order stood at Brad Binder in 1st, Aleix Espargaro, who could potentially be getting Aprili's first ever podium in the Premier class, Valentino Rossi in 3rd. He of course was retiring at the end of the year, and he was now in position to be getting a fairy tale final podium, and it would be his 200th podium as well. And at this point, everyone was going mental. Rossi in the podium spots when he's been nowhere all season, it was mental. Behind him we had Luca Marini, Iker Lecuona, Takaki Nakagami, Alex Marquez, Pol Espargaro and Danilo Petrucci, and below all them were all the people on wet tyres. Jack Miller and Alex Rins came out behind all the lads who pitted, so it was clear that they had pitted a bit too early because they had gained no advantage. And the situation was really, if the rain stayed the same as it was, if it didn't rain any heavier, people on wet tyres had no chance of catching up. The gap was simply too big. However, if it rained anymore, the people on dry tyres would have no chance of staying on the bike. It was such a tense and interesting situation because nobody knew whether it would rain more and if the people on dry tyres but on a wet track would just suddenly crash out of nowhere. Because that can easily happen when you're on a low grip track on dry tyres and on tyre temperatures that were rapidly declining. So coming straight out of the pits into turn 3, both Bagnaia and Quartararo had big moments and they both dropped to place. Quartararo especially has never been good in the wet and he especially struggled. On lap 26, Brad Binder did a 1 minute 34, a lap time 10 seconds slower than a regular dry lap time. However, it was also the same pace that Alex Rins and Jack Miller did on their previous lap, who were of course already on wet tyres. So if it stayed the same, Brad Binder would win. And there were only 2 laps left for him. But the rain was getting heavier. After lap 26, the gap from Marc Marquez to Brad Binder was 31 seconds. The people on wet tyres had only gained 2 seconds on that lap. It was looking good for Brad Binder. On to lap 27 now, the penultimate lap. Bagnaia re-overtook Jorge Martin on the home straight, and then Marc Marquez, who was leading the chase group on wet tyres, crashed out at turn 1. A race which he had a great chance of winning was completely thrown away, and he dropped right to the back of the grid. He rejoined in 16th place. And also at turn 1, Fabio Quartararo went very wide and he lost a lot of time. He was really struggling in the wet, like he always has done really. Valentino Rossi unfortunately by this point was overtaken by both Iker Lecuona and Luca Marini and dropped to 5th place, making his chances of getting a fairy tale podium looking a lot slimmer. But still, Iker Lecuona was in the podium spots, which was unheard of really. And by the end of lap 27, Bagnaia was still 27 seconds behind Brad Binder. If Binder kept it on the track, he would win, but the rain was getting much worse. It was getting torrential at this point, and it was clear that the wet tyres were the tyres to be on. All Brad Binder had to do was to stay on the bike and keep it on the track. If he did that, he would win the Austrian Grand Prix. But he had a big moment going to turn 1. The cameras didn't really pick up what happened, but he went through the escape route, which indicates to me that he just completely misjudged his braking and went wide. And then up the hill into turn 3, he had a massive slide. His bike was sideways. It looked like what Pedro Acosta looks like when he's overtaking someone. But Brad Binder showed some incredible skill and strength to keep the bike pointing in the right direction and on 2 wheels. And he somehow made the corner. I think everyone watching was convinced he would crash. Meanwhile behind him was absolute chaos. Aleix Espargaro had lost an 8-second gap to everyone behind him, and he was being passed by both Iker Lecuona and Luca Marini, and his chances of getting Aprilia's first podium were completely dashed within a few corners really. And all of this was occurring at such a slow speed. We're used to seeing MotoGP bikes going at rapid speeds, super fast acceleration out of corners, but of course as they were all still on dry tyres, they were just so tentative on the throttle, and understandably. They were generally going like so slowly, and the commentators said it looked like they were on scooters, and they were absolutely correct. The pace they were going at was almost comical. And then from absolutely nowhere in the background we saw Pecco Bagnaia going at normal speeds, and he just seemed to spawn in and overtook 5 people in 3 corners and went from 7th to 2nd immediately. He was closely followed by Jorge Martin. It was absolute chaos. Like, the pace difference between Bagnaia and the people on dry tyres was night and day really. He even nearly crashed into the back of Iker Lecuona, such was the pace difference. Like I said, he overtook 5 people in about 3 corners. However, there was one man he couldn't catch. And that is all because during all of this chaos in the middle sector, Brad Binder was making his way very slowly through the final corner, and he eventually came home to win the Austrian Grand Prix on a wet track while on dry tyres. An absolutely astonishing achievement and just mind-blowing really. And behind Binder, Pecco Bagnaia came home to get 2nd place, with Jorge Martin in 3rd and Joan Mir in 4th. And behind him, on dry tyres, was Luca Marini and Iker Lecuona in 5th and 6th. Quartararo came home to finish 7th, while Valentino Rossi came home to finish 8th. On the final lap, Bagnaia was over 14 seconds faster than Brad Binder, and Binder ended up finishing 12 seconds ahead of Bagnaia. So, if there was one more lap, then it would have been Pecco Bagnaia taking his maiden MotoGP victory. But instead, it was Brad Binder who took home only his second ever MotoGP victory, in what was the most impressive thing I've ever seen while watching the sport. It was even more impressive than watching Pedro Acosta win a race from the pit lane. Astonishing how he managed to stay on the bike and maintain a pretty decent pace on dry tyres on a track which by the end was completely soaked. This was a race which truly established Brad Binder as one of the best riders on the grid, and most certainly the bravest, and probably the most mental as well. And to this day, this is still Brad Binder's most recent race win. He's got a couple of sprint victories since then, but he's still not won a race on a Sunday, which is a real shame, but I genuinely don't think any race victory could top this, because this was absolutely stunning from Brad Binder. As well as this, we also saw career best finishes for Luca Marini and Iker Lecuona, who finished in 5th and 6th respectively. And we also saw Valentino Rossi get a season best finish of 8th. At one point we were all dreaming of him getting that fairy tale final podium in the sport. In the end it just wasn't meant to be, but it made for a bloody entertaining race. This was, without shadow of a doubt, one of the best motor races I've ever seen, full stop. Even before it started raining like properly, it was still a really entertaining race. Quartararo was pulling off some amazing overtakes, and we still had Bagnaia, Marquez and Quartararo all fighting at the front. I'm convinced that if it didn't rain, we still would have gotten an amazing race which involved those three having a great battle for the win. And there was a bit of a fear among everyone that the rain would ruin that opportunity of having the amazing battle. But instead we got a race which was one of a kind really, something that I don't think we've ever seen in MotoGP before. A race where pretty much half the grid was on dry tyres on a wet track. Something we've never seen properly before. When we have seen it, it's usually been for about half a lap when everyone just peels into the pits. And even then, the track is never as wet as it got at the end of that race. In this race, we saw truly the best riders in the world crawling around the track at a snail's pace, showing immense skill and talent to keep the bike on 2 wheels. To be able to survive nearly 3 laps of a nearly soaked track on dry tyres is something that we haven't really seen in MotoGP before, and I genuinely don't think we'll see it again for a very, very long time. This was a truly one-in-a-kind sort of race, and it was amazing to watch. Everywhere you looked, something dramatic was happening. It was just mind-blowing. I remember when I watched this, and afterwards I was just sat there absolutely gobsmacked at what I just watched. It was just unreal to see it unfold in front of my eyes. That must have been such a good race to go watch in person, I'm sure. It was simply just amazing how everybody waited all race for the rain, and then when it finally came, it was at the perfect time when the teams had to make a split decision. Do we stay out on dry tyres and take the risk of potentially crashing out, but in doing so maybe getting a better result than usual? Or do we play it safe and go on to wet tyres in the hopes that it rains even more? It was such an interesting tactical race. It was just so interesting to see how the race unfolded and how different teams and different riders played it. And having that split in the grid between those who pitted and those who didn't, and the ones who did pit being the ones who had the most to lose, who were fighting up in the championship. It just made the perfect situation to produce the most chaotic, dramatic, and just confusing race of all time. And that's what I love as a racing fan. I love seeing chaos unfold. I love seeing stuff that doesn't usually happen live on the racetrack. I think this was a race which truly brought out the best of motorcycle racing, even before it rained. The amazing overtakes, the close racing, the brilliant battles at the front, and then the change in weather and the skill that all the riders showed in making it to the end of the race. This was, I think, almost the perfect MotoGP race. It was just amazing, and it's a race which will go down in history as one of the classic races of all time, I'm convinced. And that was the story and everything that happened in the 2021 Austrian Grand Prix. The craziest MotoGP race I have ever seen in my life. This was a lot of fun to research, to rewatch the race, go over it, make some notes. I enjoyed making this video a lot, so if you guys want to see more videos like this, let me know by leaving a like on the video, and subscribing to the channel while you're there. And also, leave a comment. What other races do you want me to look back at? They do have to be races which I can watch for free somewhere on the internet, because I'm not paying 30 quid for a month of video pass. That's taking the piss. If you've got any suggestions, let me know in the comments. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys very soon. Bye bye.